I do not think it means what you think it means, Joseph.
But walk the pathway which leads to it. And that pathway, said he, is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping of all the commandments of God. It was the prophet Joseph who declared, the prophet Joseph Smith taught us, the prophet Joseph Smith taught, the prophet Joseph Smith said,
The prophet Joseph Smith taught.
the prophet Joseph Smith said, happiness is the object and the design of our existence.
Happiness is the object and design of our existence.
Happiness is the object and design of our existence.
Happiness is the object and design of our existence.
Happiness is the object and design of our existence.
Happiness.
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 Happiness. Happiness. Happiness.
Happiness is the object and the design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we will but pursue the path which leads to it.
And will be the end thereof if we pursue a path that leads to it.
And will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it.
And will be the end thereof if we but pursue the path which leads to it.
And will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it.
And will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it.
And will be the end thereof.
And will be the end thereof.
It will be the end thereof.
The end thereof.
The end thereof.
The end thereof.
Be the end thereof.
Thereof.
If we pursue the path that leads to it.
And that path is virtue.
Virtue.
Virtue. Virtue.
Virtue.
Virtue.
Virtue.
Virtue. Virtue. Virtue.
Uprightness.
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 Uprightness. Uprightness. Uprightness.
Faithfulness.
Faithfulness.
Faithfulness. Faithfulness.
Faithfulness.
Faithfulness.
Faithfulness.
Holiness.
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 And keeping all of the commandments of God.
And keeping all the commandments of God.
Keeping all the commandments of God.
And keeping all the commandments of God. The prophet Joseph declared, happiness is the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God.
Special divine permission is nothing new when you look at religious charlatans. Self-proclaimed prophet David Koresh of the Branch Davidians claimed special divine permission to take child brides for the purpose of producing the 24 elders foretold in the book of Revelations. Special proclaimed prophet Wayne Bent of the Lord Our Righteousness Church claimed special divine permission for having sexual relations with children, even his own daughter-in-law, in order to avoid God's punishment. Self-proclaimed prophet Julius Shacknow of the sect known as The Work claimed special privilege to promise salvation in exchange for sexual intercourse with women and children, including his own stepdaughter. Self-proclaimed prophet Tony Alamo of Alamo Christian Ministries claimed special biblical permission to illegally marry multiple women and children. Special proclaimed prophet David Berg of the Children of God claimed special divine permission to normalize sexual relation with children. Prophets justifying their own predations as special divine permission through the use of pious language and religious sentiment is nothing new. They should be seen for the predators that they are. But how is a naive 19-year-old in the 1800s confronted by the very prophet she has revered from the age of 8 supposed to know that? Joseph uses this section of the letter to impose his authority, to draw the line between illicit relations that receive God's blessings and those which do not. Having underlined this point, Joseph then moves on to reinforce the theme of happiness as linked to his proposition. All right, so moving on to the next section. But in obedience there is joy and peace unspotted, unalloyed, and as God has designed our happiness, the happiness of all his creatures, he never will institute an ordinance or give a commandment to his people that is not calculated in its nature to promote that happiness which he has designed and which will not end in the greatest amount of good and glory to those who become the recipients of his laws and ordinances. Now, one of the most powerful ways to induce someone to act against their previously held principles is to subvert their higher values. Joseph knows that his target is extremely devout and God-fearing, and he's already inculcated her mind with the idea that he alone can declare the will of God. He's declared his deviant proposal to be a righteous and blessed command of God and attempted to alleviate his target's fear of punishment because his proposition contradicts her own moral sensibilities. He is leveraging her reverence of God against her own moral conscience. He takes the concept a step further by conflating obedience to God with obedience to a man who claims to speak for God. In Joseph's eye, there's no distinction between the two, so as long as it's Joseph's version of God's commands that are obeyed. Joseph continues to wax poetic about the glorious blessings that will accompany obedience to his will, a joy and happiness that are actually God's design from the beginning. In fact, Joseph assures his young target that God would never command anything that would lead to anything other than happiness, and not just any happiness, but the greatest amount of good and glory. This is exactly how religious predators play the trust me, I only want what's best for you card. This idea certainly carries more weight when you transpose it so that it appears to come from God, but the intentions are the same. The goal of the charlatan is to break down any resistance or concern that may exist in the mind of their target so that the trusting target can be induced to surrender to their will. For those who want proof of the fictitious nature of this promise that obedience to polygamy can only lead to happiness, just look at the lives of the women who were subsequently afflicted with it. Even the most vocal modern apologists for the church on polygamy, Brian Hales, concedes that it was a terrible experience in practice, far from the promised bliss of this letter. In the end, the modern church can only rely on law, command, and obedience as justification for the practice of polygamy because conscience, ethics, equality, morality, and stability all scream out against it. The next section. Blessings offered but rejected are no longer blessings, but become like the talent hid in the earth by the wicked and slothful servant. The proffered good returns to the giver. The blessing is bestowed on those who will receive and occupy. For unto him that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundantly. But unto him who hath not or will not receive shall be taken away that which he hath or might have had. Here it becomes apparent that there's a pattern to Joseph's letter. He repeatedly alternates between offering positive assurances and blessings for accepting his proposition or offering threats threats, and punishment for refusing it. This section carries the theme of negative consequences for refusal. Pleasant language and biblical imagery are employed to soften the message that anyone who refuses to be Joseph's secret bride or sexual plaything is wicked and slothful. Not only will they miss out on the glorious blessings, they'll also lose blessings that they already have now. This is perhaps the nicest way to make a bold-faced threat against someone who may rebel. It would not be surprising to hear such a threat be uttered by an organized crime syndicate against a business owner. After all, gee, it will be a shame if something was, to happen to that nice store you got. That routine is very common in the shakedown. Manipulative religionists follow this routine in a different way. As Joseph showcases here, it would be like, gee, it would be a shame if all those blessings that you were enjoying were to be taken away. These are not the words of a man of God instilling virtue. These are the words of a predator who uses tacit threats and manipulation to induce a vulnerable target to fall victim to his carnal designs. Now, by including a poetic stanza here, Joseph takes a cue from John C. Bennett. Be wise today, 'tis madness to defer. The next day the fatal precedent may plead thus on till wisdom is pushed out of time into eternity. Now, if you read Bennett's expose or any of his writing, he interjects poetry very, very frequently, and we can see here Joseph is kind of adopting this approach. He cites a verse which uses emotionally charged language such as madness, fatal precedent, wisdom, eternity, in an attempt to override the moral conscience of a youth with urgency and fear. This subtle manipulation speaks to Joseph's amoral intuition and facility with language, specifically the power of language to influence others. Joseph was a powerful orator in public and in private. Nancy's resistance to this manipulation is a testament to her character and strength. Having laid down some tacit threats, Joseph now shifts to making glorious promises once again. Our Heavenly Father is more liberal in his views and boundless in his mercies and blessings than we are ready to receive. Once again, Joseph attempts to redefine morality in the mind of his prey. If he can introduce a vague uncertainty about the boundaries of propriety, he can then more easily redefine morality on the strength of his claimed status as the mouthpiece of God. If God's views are more liberal than we're equipped to receive, it means that our old-fashioned notions of sin and moral behavior are potentially more strict than God actually intends. This branch of thought neatly complements Joseph's November 1841 sermon where he declared that what many people call sin is not sin. And these ideas carry the combined implication that the prudish objections to Joseph's extra-legal marital adventures are actually based on the outdated and overly restrictive morals and keep objectors from actually receiving God's blessings. This is the effect intended upon the mind of young Nancy. Moving on. And at the same time is more terrible to the workers of iniquity, more awful in the executions of his punishments, and more ready to detect every false way than we are apt to suppose him to be. He will be inquired of by his children. He says, ask and you shall receive, seek and ye shall find. But if you will take that which is not your own or which I have not given you, you shall be rewarded according to your deeds. Again, Joseph switches to offering threats. And the brilliance of these contrasting themes in his letters is that he's shaping a new moral framework in the mind of his target. If Nancy's conscience was previously defined by principles such as devotion, fidelity, chastity, Joseph is breaking those ideas down and redefining morality by reframing it to match his own goals. The new moral boundaries can be located by observing where the blessings and punishments are staked. According to Joseph, devotion is found in compliance with God's commands through his prophet. Fidelity is defined as staying true to God and his prophet. Chastity is expanded to be a concept that allows any relations given special permission by God's prophet. Underlying all of this is the unavoidable truth that in Joseph's new religious framework, there is only one virtue, obedience. All other virtues are subordinate to obedience, and obedience may trump any other virtue at any other time, allowing even extremes of murder and genocide should God through Joseph command it, making polygamy trivial. But no good thing will I withhold from them who walk uprightly before me and do my will in all things and will listen to my voice and the voice of my servant who I have sent. Now when David Koresh, Marshall Applewhite, Jim Jones, or any other self-proclaimed mouthpiece of God instructs others to submit to some heinous act which betrays their conscience, the prudent response is to recoil, to reject their claims and see these men for the pretenders that they are. The idea that God would use such men to order abominable things refutes their claim to speak for God in the first place. The deception of these charlatans is laid bare no matter how flowing, beautiful, or pious their rhetoric. They will insist that their words are not their own but God's, and thus cannot be rejected. To object to those instructions is to object to God's will. Charlatans continue to employ this tactic because it is so effective against devoted people who have a deep, sincere desire to please God and who are not familiar with the methods of such manipulation. Joseph mimics this tactic here in this stanza. He promises blessings for complete obedience while subtly giving equivalence to the voice of God and his own. He uses the voice of God to declare that he is God's mouthpiece in a bit of circular logic that can only be seen by those who are not already under his spell. Joseph God here is speaking with words found nowhere else in Scripture. He is delivering a revelation that is no less universal or significant than those found in the Doctrine and Covenants. In society today, a middle-aged man using the name of God against a teenage girl, inducing her to secretly commit and make herself sexually available to him, is correctly identified as a manipulative predator. Such predators have existed for as long as people have held special reverence for God. In the case of the Happiness Letter, Joseph exposes his true character to match those manipulative predators joining their ranks. Joseph concludes his letter still speaking in the voice of God. For I delight in those who diligently seek to know my precepts and abide by the laws of my kingdom. For all things shall be made known to them in mine own due time, and in the end they shall have joy. Joseph God here establishes that God's favor is found only in complying with his wishes. Blind obedience is the order of the day. Delight, joy, happiness. This letter is peppered with carrots to be dangled in front of the devoted, naive, and credulous. Nancy had lived in the shadow of the prophet since she was a young child. Her own father's position in the world was held at Joseph's good favor, producing underlying pressure to please the prophet. He threatens her with lost blessings, God's disfavor, and eternal detriment to her soul. This letter contains every manipulative and coercive tool that a religious predator has at their disposal, draped in flowery language and plied against a youth with such a desperate position of power in their community that it would make Harvey Weinstein blush. To accept Joseph as a true prophet and accept his assertions in this letter as God's will is to accept both prophet and God as abusive, coercive, and manipulative, with the prophet enjoying divine sanction to satisfy his own carnal lusts at the expense of the innocent and vulnerable. Examining the happiness letter for what it is causes a moral person to see Joseph in a new light. The letter shows a side of Joseph that is usually clouded with religious cunning, a secret side which can be perceived when the letter is viewed in the context of its writing and the subject of its prose and the psychological manipulation in its wording. These same manipulative, subversive, and amoral sentiments are found peppered throughout his sermons and revelations, although they're usually better hidden behind vague allusions, scriptural adornment, and plausible deniability. Every deplorable point in this letter has its equivalent in section 132. Now, imagine the same words here secretly delivered from some other religious leader to a youth in his congregation over whom he has been licking his lip for years. Would you think such a man spoke for God just because he claimed it? If you rejected his godly claims sanctioned in this act, would you accept any other claimed communication or authority from God by this man? Would you accept it from any other modern church leader of the same? Would you believe any of these 6 people on the right if they, knowing about their sexual predations, also gave you pleasant sermons? Would that be something that you would want to internalize? These are the questions that should echo in the heart of a person of conscience when considering the words of the prophet Joseph directed to young Nancy Rigdon in the happiness letter. Every time a church leader invokes the phrase, happiness is the object and design of our existence, these questions scream all the louder. The happiness letter and the circumstances which brought it into existence do not depict a man of God. They are the marks of a wolf who adorned himself with the affectation of godliness in order to exploit the trusting and devoted nature of the people around him. It's a credit to the strength and will and courage of Nancy Rigdon that she resisted his predations and raised the alarm to warn others of his nature. She was a whistleblower of the early church. While her efforts were overwhelmed by the forces of other men around her, she stands tall in Mormon history, and we are in her debt for exposing Joseph's hidden character. Thank you.
Don't you want devoted followers who leave their families for you, give their money to you, give their bodies to you, give up their lives for you, consider you God, and will kill for you? Don't you want to become a cult leader?